You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 73. I'm Jennifer, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Elliot Swartz, who is the principal scientist of cultivated meat at the Good Food Institute. Dr. Swartz, thank you so much for being on the show, and I'm excited to talk to you today about cultivated meat, which a lot of folks know of as lab-grown meat, or there's lots of different terms for it. I'm sure you'll get into it. But first, I want to start with having you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to work in this field.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Jennifer. So basically, I'm a stem cell biologist by training. And so in graduate school, I worked with human stem cells to model diseases, in particular ALS, which is a neuromuscular disease. And so I was making muscle tissue from human stem cells as a means to further understand the sort of genetic underpinnings of disease. And around halfway through that, I learned about cultivated meat. It was around the time, I would say 2014, 2015, when some of the first companies in this sector were founded. And so there was some attention in the press on the fundraisers that were being announced. And I was already, quite, interested in getting passionate about climate and figuring out, is there anything that I could do to address this sort of big issue of what, is going to be of my entire lifetime. And this was this cultivated meat idea was just really captivating to me as a way to sort of address that and play a role. And so I really became interested in it from that point on, following the industry, its development. And throughout that time, I learned about, the Good Food Institute, which was a nonprofit that was newly formed to try to sort of move this and other alternative protein technologies into the marketplace. And so I noticed that there was a job opening there about the time that I was due to graduate. And so I had the position lined up right after grad school. And I've been working there now for about 6 years.
I want to talk about what the Good Food Institute does as well, but I think it's important to, address the idea that, I know a lot of our listeners are probably obviously very environmentally minded and vegetarians or vegans, and the idea of eating meat, is a bit hard or something that they're not interested in. And so I will, address that I am not a vegetarian myself. I'm trying to eat less meat, but I was intrigued by this idea because I know there are folks who will never get to completely give up meat in the world, right? Or there's people that for dietary reasons can't manage a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle, or there's access. There's lots of reasons why people wouldn't be able to totally move away from a meat-based diet. And I think, addressing that and recognizing that and not ostracizing folks for that is important, but also having this option that people can do it ethically and in a way that makes sense for the climate is exciting. And that's kind of what I thought when I first heard about lab-grown meat years ago. I think I read about it in Science magazine or something. And it was just, to me, wow, I could actually eat this product and not have to kill an entire animal. That's revolutionary in my mind. And if we can get it to scale, that'd be even more exciting. So I guess just throwing that out there for anybody who's listening and conflicted and has thoughts.
I'm very similar. So I was already eating less meat in graduate school as I learned more about animal agriculture's climate impact and other externalities. And then so I ended up going vegetarian when I started the job, because I felt like if I was going to be talking the talk, I sort of needed to walk the walk a little bit. But you're right that that's not the choice that the vast majority of people will take. Generally speaking, organizations' belief is that, we have decades of evidence of people trying to push people into a more vegetarian or vegan diet, eat your beans, eat your lentils, etc. But despite all of those efforts and those education efforts, meat consumption per capita continues to go up all around the world, even in the United States, which already has a huge, the highest number of meat consumption per capita. And meat consumption by basically every scientific projection is expected to go up by at least 50%, maybe even double by the year 2050. And so the trajectory that we're on right now is that meat is going up, 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 and up, and the number of vegans and vegetarians on a sort of percentage level basically has remained steady, over time. And so I think, yeah, well, we can get into this, but the theory of change, the philosophy, is really about offering people an alternative without having to make a large behavioral shift. And we think that is the way that you can sort of scalably address things without people having to make a sacrifice.
Yeah, great points. And yeah, we'll get into some of that. But first, I guess let's start by talking about the Good Food Institute, what they do, and your role at the organization. And then we can talk a little bit more about how meat is grown, cultivated in a lab.
Sure. So the Good Food Institute, we call ourselves GFI for short. We're a network of international nonprofits that are essentially trying to reimagine protein production. And so we have teams in the United States. There's maybe 115 staff in the United States. And then we have affiliate teams also in Brazil, Europe, Israel, India, and the Asia Pacific region based out of Singapore, and hopefully expanding into other parts of Asia in short order as well. But essentially our programmatic work is the same across these organizations. And so we do science and technology work. That's the team that I'm on. And we have a couple of different focus areas. So my focus area in a nutshell is really about understanding what are the technical and economic bottlenecks that are facing this industry. What sort of research needs to be prioritized to, alleviate those bottlenecks? How do we mobilize the resources, the people, the funding in order to address some of these challenges before they become, too much of a challenge in the near future? We also have a team that does education and workforce development. So starting university sort of chapters on campuses to increase student involvement into the mission, as well as curriculum and training programs. And then we finally, on the science side of things, we also have a research grants program. And so part of the way that we sort of get our ideas out to the world is we can prioritize and say, these are the areas of research that we need to be working on. And then we can actually go and fund researchers to go out and start to do that. We also have teams that focus on corporate engagement. So that's mostly, educating the investor and corporate community. So teaching them about like where things are today, the trajectory at which things are going, where are the opportunities for businesses or new businesses to sort of get into the fold and play a role in the development. And then finally, on the policy side of things, there's really two main focuses. The first is to ensure that there's a fair and clear path to regulation so that these products can come onto the marketplace. And then secondarily, it's really about getting more public investment into this sector. So getting governments to really buy into this as a climate solution, as a public health solution. That means more public funding going into the research and development efforts around the world in academic labs, but also into the commercialization aspects. So the industrialization, the build out of infrastructure, just like any other sort of capital intensive industry, whether it's, electric vehicles, renewable energy, batteries, you have governments playing a really important role in getting those businesses started and getting them to scale so that they become competitive into the marketplace. And so likewise, we need governments to really buy in to alternative proteins in order to get them to the scale at which they're going to actually have meaningful effects on the world.
Yeah, so many of the actions and climate initiatives that are necessary to kind of stave off impending disaster are going to really require government buy-in. I think that's an important point. So great work that you're doing, and hopefully we're successful in getting some of that accomplished. I guess let's start by just talking about, for first things first, what is cultivated or lab-grown meat, and how is it different from the meat we consume today from the grocery store?
Yeah, good question. So I think when you do consumer research, of which there's been a lot that has been published, but really only about 10% of the population thus far is probably familiar enough with cultivated meat where they could sit down at a dinner table and explain it to someone. So I think it's important to sort of level set and what we're actually talking about here. So cultivated meat is real, genuine animal meat. It's grown in a safe, controlled environment in a food facility that looks like a beer or yogurt production facility. And the result is a nutritious product that looks, cooks, and tastes just like regular meat. So, down to the sort of cellular genetic level, it's essentially the same as the animal meat or seafood that you would be consuming. So, and the difference is really about the method of production. So, essentially, what you do to create cultivated meat is you'll take a sample of animal cells, a biopsy can be really small. It's done under local anesthesia. The animal can then go and live its life happily. After that, you take those cells back to the lab and you'll select for the cells, the muscle or the fat, other tissue types of interest for meat production. And then you will essentially grow those cells in nutrients that is essentially kind of like a glorified Gatorade, but it contains amino acids, glucose, vitamins, minerals, etc. All the things that cells need to survive in your body. They're just grown in a controlled environment, something we call a cultivator, but more sort of scientifically termed a bioreactor that enables you to control the temperature, the conditions, etc. Those cells are essentially grown and then they can be used as ingredients or formed into more structured meat products that look exactly like the cuts of meat that you're familiar with. So those are, I think that's like a general sort of high level overview of production. But of course, the major differences is that you don't have to raise and slaughter an animal in order to produce cultivated meat. And also it can be produced entirely antibiotic free. And so that's a major advantage as well.
So can all types of animals or cuts of meat be grown in this way, or are there limitations?
Yeah, I mean, basically any animal could be used in theory. So obviously the focus of companies in the industry is to develop products that are highly consumed already, beef, pork, chicken, seafood, etc. But you can create really anything from those animals, but also organ meats, so foie gras, which is duck liver, um, milk even. So you can grow mammary cells that can secrete milk or ingredients from milk. And so basically anything that an animal produces, you can take those cells and use them to produce those products instead without the animal. The broader term, cellular agriculture, basically extends beyond just meat and seafood products. And so that includes things like leather, which companies are working on commercializing. So basically, cultivated leather, and then you can extend that even further into other agricultural products. There are even companies working to commercialize cultivation of plant cells to create chocolate. So growing cocoa cells to create chocolate, or growing cotton cells to create cottonseed. So there's a bunch of other extensions of this, but principally it's all about cultivating the cells, and you don't need the animal anymore if you're doing that in basically every case.
So we've kind of alluded to there's environmental benefits to this practice, obviously, but how does this process compare to traditional farming when you're talking in terms of cost, resources needed, and environmental impact? Like what specifically makes it better or worse?
Yeah, so cost it's still much higher than commodity meats that you're going to be purchasing at a supermarket. Um, as I mentioned, the sort of birth of this industry happened around 10 years ago, where the first cultivated burger was debuted actually on television in London. And that was said to cost around $300,000 just to make that single burger. There are actually two of them, but um, the costs have come down by orders of magnitude since then. But it's still you're starting to you're basically from scratch, and you're competing with something that's existed for thousands of years that's heavily industrialized. So it's going to take some time to catch up in terms of cost. And so it's difficult to pinpoint, I would say, exactly where costs are at today, because companies are essentially just starting to commercialize. They're not yet producing at large scale. What I would say is that, based on the studies that have been done, so the cost models that have been produced, as well as just my general knowledge of where things are at, I think, current production today could probably be competitive with like high priced items like foie gras that I mentioned before, or like bluefin tuna, for instance. But to be competitive with more of the sort of commonly consumed meats, the general near term strategy is to essentially create what are called hybrid products. And so that's where you're actually using these cultivated cells as ingredients and mixing them in with plant proteins or other sort of texturized plant ingredients. And so the strategy there is sort of like a hybrid vehicle where, initially the introduction of electric vehicles, it was difficult to do that because the battery costs so much. And so, in order to defray the costs and make those more marketable to a broader population, they put a hybrid vehicle together where, have a smaller battery, but also a combustion engine. And so similar here, you're basically diluting the high cost of those animal cells with more affordable plant-based ingredients. The animal cells hopefully should, provide the taste that a lot of plant-based products are lacking. So the actual sensory, organoleptic, aroma, taste, etc. So that the plant-based products are otherwise improved. And these products, it will be interesting to see what companies do. But if some companies are just creating fat, for instance, and so you can have just 5% of the product be cultivated fat cells, and fat contains a lot of the molecules that you are smelling and tasting when you're eating meat. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have companies that introduce products that are 80% cultivated cells and a smaller percentage of plant-based ingredients. So that's on the cost side, just to give folks a sense of where things are today. On the environmental impact side of things, so I've was involved in a study over the course of 3 years that's now published. So we've looked at this fairly closely about how does it compare to conventional animal agriculture, and the key thing I think to understand is that it's all about efficiency. And so, based on the data that we collected, our estimates are that cultivated meat would be nearly 3 times as efficient as chicken production, which is basically the most efficient form of conventional meat production. So that means you need fewer crops to feed to the cells to get the same amount of meat out. And that has a ton of different sort of knock on consequences. Most importantly, being that you need way less land to cultivate meat in this way. And so the estimates generally in our study, depending on what you compare to, is that land use would be decreased by about 60 to 90%, whether you're comparing to chicken to beef. And those are really importantly large numbers when you consider the amount of land on Earth that's dedicated to animal agriculture. And so with that decrease in land, you have additional opportunities in the future, hopefully, that would arise for things like carbon sequestration from reforestation. You have biodiversity protection from ecosystems being restored, or you can use that land in other ways, like renewable energy build out, for instance. Essentially, another point around the efficiency is that you also don't have the same amount of waste, and so animals produce a lot of manure, and you also need a lot of fertilizer to feed the feed crops that are grown to animals. And so a lot of the studies that have been done thus far basically show that you would have also lower environmental impacts in categories like eutrophication, which is essentially nutrient runoff that goes into fresh waterways and creates dead zones in the ocean. You'd have less acidification of soils. You'd have also less air pollution. So that's pretty consistent across studies, just based on the sort of principles that we know about production. And then I think the thing that most people are probably interested in is carbon footprint and energy use. And so on the energy side of things, it is expected to be probably more energy intensive than most conventional meat production processes. The difference here is that you're actually able to quote unquote electrify meat production. And so that means you can use renewable energy to power these facilities. And so if you do that, you can decrease the carbon footprint by about 70% from where it otherwise would be if you're running on a sort of traditional mix. And that's important because that would essentially enable you, based on our estimates, to undercut the carbon footprint of virtually all conventional meat or farmed seafood production on Earth. And it's also important in terms of timing, because right now we're going through an energy transition where green energy will hopefully become much more abundant in the future. It's getting way more easy to build new infrastructure that has renewable energy built into it, solar panels, etc. And so since cultivated meat is just starting out, it's going to be growing alongside of this. And so just like electric vehicles, where if you plug in to charge today, you're probably having a mix of fossil fuels that are part of that grid. But in the future, it's going to be even lower in terms of its emissions profile, because those grids are going to be run on predominantly renewable energy. And those are things that you just can't really do in the conventional animal agriculture system, because other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, methane, land use change contribute to a large portion of the emissions profile. And they're also distributed all over the supply chain rather than at a single point at the production facility. So I think all of those things together make the story for cultivated meat as a climate part of the climate solution. Is not like a single bullet sort of silver bullet solution, but part of the solution to reduce emissions from the animal agriculture food sector.
And is the greenhouse gas reduction you mentioned, is that just including actual electricity or energy needed to do this work, or is it also including emissions from the animals themselves, like methane from cows, etc.?
Yeah, so that's inclusive of basically the carbon footprint equivalents. So that is inclusive of CO2 emissions, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., all in there. And yeah.
Okay, because I think that's for me, one of the first things I thought of when I heard about this, like, oh wow, the reduction in greenhouse gases could be huge, since we hear that agriculture accounts for such a huge chunk of, I don't know the exact percentage, but worldwide, how much emissions come from that. So that's an interesting, thing to think about when we're looking at the benefits of this form of production. So we kind of touched on how industrialization of farming has had severe impacts on the environment, but also on human and animal health as well, from the standpoint of pollution and land use, etc. But additionally, there's been a lot of talk lately about how in the COVID-19 pandemic kind of brought this home, with diseases crossing over from animals to humans. And a lot of these CAFO operations, these big industrial farms, are kind of rife for those diseases. We're seeing, even in the US right now, a lot of viruses being spread to humans and around the world, where they're in such close contact with these animals, and the animals are so close together that they just spread like wildfire, and there's nowhere for them to really to go. So I guess looking at this from that perspective, it seems that cultivated meat has the potential to reduce this danger, and especially if it's scaled up. So is it possible that all meat consumed by humans could be grown in a lab, and then eventually eliminating the need for animal farming entirely, or at least their use for meat?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and you're definitely right that the current ways that we produce meat, which is primarily in confined animal operations, is very, very risky from a sort of zoonotic disease threat. We're seeing that right now with avian flu, H5N1, in the U.S., which is infecting dairy cattle, poultry farms, and has crossed over to at least over a dozen humans already. So we definitely want to avoid that. In terms of your question on, you know, it's totally possible in the future. It really depends on what timeline we're talking about, though. So, in the short term, this is really about diversifying meat production, bringing a more sustainable and ethical option to consumers. Um, the scales at which it's produced today are very, very low. And meat production, there's about 500 million tons of meat that's consumed, and meat and seafood that's consumed annually. And we're talking about cultivated meat producing, a couple hundred kilograms maybe right now around the world. So as it scales up, I think the hope is that it would reduce, the rate of growth of conventional meat production. As I mentioned, all the projections are basically up and to the right. And so together with other alternative proteins, plant-based meat, also fermentation-derived animal proteins or foods, basically start to maybe shift meat production from this industrialized factory farm sort of model that's very risky in multiple different ways, to something that's more higher welfare, regenerative type of methods. So one of the things we talked about was land use, and so if you have all this land being potentially freed up, then you can actually use that for higher welfare practices of animal production, regenerative methods, which tend to use about 2 to 3 times more land. Organic farming uses more land, generally has lower yields, but there's a lot of other sort of things to like about those practices. And so it's really hopefully about, at least in my lifetime, my career, that's how I see, what I would like to see, that sort of curve toward that direction. But it's really dependent on a lot of different factors, and it will take a while for this to scale because it's all sort of new infrastructure that needs to be put in place, etc. I think it is worth mentioning, though, that it's not likely that cultivated meat is going to displace smallholder farmers or subsistence farmers and fishers, around the world, especially in the global south, anytime soon. Right now, it's really just about, like I mentioned, diversifying the options that a lot of consumers might have, so that they can make a more sustainable or ethical choice in their food purchasing habits in the near future.
Yeah, it's like any new technology. It's always expensive and hard to implement at the beginning, but then over time, hopefully, with enough investment, like you said, from governments and investors, et cetera, it'll be more sustainable and affordable on a wider scale. So I guess we'll see how that trends. Um, okay, so we've talked about what cultivated meat is, how it's produced, some of the benefits environmentally from that. But are there any health risks associated with consuming meat produced in this way? I know a lot of people freak out when they hear about food that's been modified in any way. So maybe they hear about this and think it's genetically modified meat, and I don't know, maybe it is in a certain way. So can you address maybe some of these worries?
Sure. Yes. So I've spent a decent amount of time on this topic, actually. I went to a meeting that was convened by the UN's FAO and World Health Organization in Singapore on this topic. There's a lengthy report called "Cell-Based Food Safety Aspects of Cell-Based Foods," that was a result of that meeting that people can read online if they're interested in sort of understanding this more deeply. But really, I think the takeaway from that work, and having all these regulators in the room, is that cultivated meat is just meat, but it's made in a different way. And so there have been 4 different regulatory agencies around the world thus far that have evaluated cultivated meat in detail and given it a green light on its safety. In the United States, so both of the FDA and the USDA oversee cultivated meat jointly in the United States. And when the FDA, cleared the first products for sale, they essentially said, there's no properties of these cells that would render them different from animal cells with respect to safety for food. And so the cultivated meat product itself is very familiar. It's meat. We've been eating that for literally thousands of years. The methods employed to produce it are different, but they're actually not that different from other food production technologies, like fermented foods like beer, yogurt production. We also know a lot about cell culture safety generally from the biomedical world. And so it hasn't really been that problematic for regulators to be able to evaluate this and feel confident in saying that, look, when this reaches your plates, it's going to be safe, just like other foods. And just like other foods, there will be steps implemented by companies to mitigate risk. Regulators are in charge of ensuring the safety. There's inspectors in these facilities. I think, it is a misnomer to call it lab grown meat, because these products are produced in a food production facility, just like any other food product. The same USDA inspectors that are in, conventional meat facilities, processing facilities, are going to be in cultivated meat facilities as well. And so I think that's important to sort of understand, is that there's frameworks in place that we can evaluate the safety of foods, whether they're novel or not, and have pretty high confidence that they will result in a safe product.
Okay, so that's comforting to know that there are already government oversights in place, at least in the U.S. and I'm sure around the world, that kind of monitor this as it's coming to market. And on that note, can consumers buy this now? Like the average consumer, maybe not a millionaire that has 300,000 to drop on a burger, but can you go to certain stores or order it online somewhere? I don't know, to get this. And if so, I know you kind of mentioned the cost is up there, but what does it compare to, as far as like what's out there now?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, we're recording this in September 2024. So the current status is that cultivated meat has been cleared for sale in 3 countries: the United States, Singapore, and Israel. There's actually been a cultivated pet food product cleared for sale in the UK as well. In addition to that, it's under regulatory. There are products under regulatory review in 8 different regions and countries around the world. So, in addition to the ones that I mentioned, there's also applications in Switzerland, in the EU, in Australia, New Zealand, and in South Korea. And so, regulators all over the world right now are looking at products and getting to understand how companies are actually producing this. So, with that said, it's still very limited in terms of what people can actually get. In Singapore, that's really the place right now. And there's a couple restaurants that are selling cultivated quail product, actually produced by a company in Australia. And so their whole sort of idea is to create new meat experiences entirely. And so they went with an animal that's not really conventionally consumed in high quantities. A Japanese quail is the product. And so that's in a few restaurants in Singapore. And there's a cultivated chicken product in one single retail outlet. And it's this hybrid product, again, that has a low percentage of cultivated cells in it, with mixed in with plant-based ingredients. But that's pretty cool, because that's the first time that consumers can actually go to a store, open a frozen cabinet, and then take it home and cook with it. So that just happened earlier this year. You mentioned prices. So generally these companies, they will put the price a little bit higher than what you would find, whether it's on the restaurant menu or at the grocery store, than what you would find for its sort of the conventional version of it. That doesn't imply that that's the actual cost, though. And so, they're losing money on the sales, but you have to get the products on the market to get, consumer feedback, that sort of thing. And I would say in general, as we touched on, grocery stores where, you can go down to your Walmart or Ralph's or, whatever, that's on a much longer time scale. And so, I think some select retailers may carry it at like single locations over the next few years. Like, maybe somewhere in Berkeley, there might be like a retailer that has it because there's companies there. But, the broad rollout is much further out. I think that's really like mostly a 2030s sort of story.
Okay, so still pretty limited, but growing. There is some. You said that there's is it a restaurant that's offering unique species of quail? Is it a restaurant? And that made me think, like, there's maybe potential for endangered or hard to find animals that people like to eat in this market. Like, could that help, I guess, with over hunting or poaching of some of these animals? Is there potential there for that?
Yeah, so it is a quail product that's at I think three different restaurants in Singapore now. Those are like sort of more Michelin, upper end restaurants that's being served. Yeah, I mean, this point around exotic or endangered animals is interesting. I think the best example right now is there's a couple companies trying to commercialize Japanese eel. And so eel is endangered or it's threatened at least. And it's also challenging because you can't farm eel. Their reproductive life cycle makes it very challenging to do that. So essentially, what you do is you go out and catch eel, and then you throw them in a tank, and then you raise them from there. But you can't start from that. They don't do well. But people like eel, especially in Asia. So that's one use case that I think cultivated meat's great because it's a high priced item. It's something that's hard to farm, etc. I think if you get into more exotic species, then you might run into trade offs where if you get people used to eating lion or giraffe or something weird, then that could cause people to go out and kill those animals as well. And so generally the focus is on things that people consume in large amounts today. But we'll see what directions things might head in the future.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of, I guess, mostly fish, like fish that are being overfished or sharks that are, hunted down just for their fins or something like that, where maybe it might offer an alternative for people to not do those things, but obviously you wouldn't want to then encourage them to do the opposite. So I guess there's a fine line there to figure out. You also mentioned that, this products are becoming available in they're currently available in 3 countries with potential for more. So going back to what you said at the beginning of our chat, in the countries where they're currently available, or maybe even elsewhere, is there government funding or supports for these things? Like, I know that's a big part of your job is trying to get the government to put their money where their mouth is. So is that happening, or are there roadblocks in that area?
Yeah, so our policy team tracks this, and it's slow right now. So there's a couple of countries that in particular stand out. That would be Singapore and Israel in particular. And the reason why those governments are so supportive is because of a food security. And those countries import the vast majority of their meat supply because they don't have much arable land to use. And so this offers them a solution to grow food on their own soil in an efficient way that would be more resilient in light of climate